Hi, my name's Andrew Wallace and I'm the Federal Member for Fisher, and I'm with Simon Birmingham, Senator, who's also the Education Minister. Simon, thanks very much for having me in your office.
Thanks, Andrew.
I just wanted to ask you a couple of questions and try and demystify some of the stories that are going around in relation to education funding. So first of all, if I could just ask you, what does Gonski needs-based funding mean?
Well, Andrew, the simple way of putting it is that it means we treat every school across Australia in a fair, consistent manner where we allocate and work out how much funding they need based on the number of students in that school and in the individual circumstances of those who might need some extra support. So extra support for students who come from particularly disadvantaged backgrounds, or for students with a disability, for students who have problems with their language background and not having English as their prime language, or for Indigenous students or small rural and regional remote schools. So it's about really building from the ground up, based on who's in a school, the needs-based funding to back that school, and doing it without fear or favour, or without different rules for different states or different school sectors, and that's what the Turnbull government's applying, and that's why David Gonski stood alongside us 3 weeks ago to give the thumbs up to our reforms.
Okay, so traditionally, as I understand it, state schools predominantly are funded by the states. The federal government tips in some money, but the predominant funder is the states. How do you calculate the allocation of funding between, say, Mooloolaba State School and, say, Siena Catholic Primary School?
So the history of school funding, you're right, in Australia is that state governments take the lion's share of responsibility for state schools, and the federal government has done so for non-government schools. We're not changing that, but we're applying the same consistent needs-based formula. It's called the Schooling Resource Standard, and what we'll do is we will transition all non-government schools onto getting an 80% share of that needs-based standard. So it still looks at the individual circumstances of each school, but we'll fund 80% of that from the federal government. In the state government sector, we'll transition to funding 20% of that needs-based model across all state government schools. That's a record high in terms of the amount of support the federal government provides to those schools. It wasn't that long ago that less than 10% of state school funding came from the federal government. We'll now be bringing that up to a 20% benchmark right across the country.
Great. So with the non-government schools, so you've got your Catholic schools and your independent schools, they are funded to the tune of 80%, is that right, from the federal government perspective?
That's right.
And the federal government will be funding them equally, no matter what sector they belong to, whether it's independent, whether it's Catholic or Calathumpian, it doesn't make any difference to us.
Indeed. Like a really simple way of thinking about that is, rather than what's been a history of special deals that have advantaged one system or sector over another, we're running exactly the same funding model, so that if you walked up to a non-government school and you changed the name on the gate of who ran that school from one system, say a Catholic system, into an Anglican school or whatever else, the funding would stay the same inside the school gate, assuming the kids were the same, the families were the same, the need was the same. And I think most people would think that's a pretty fair way of doing it.
Sounds pretty fair to me. So over the next 10 years, we're increasing our spending at a federal level by $18.6 million, is that right? 18.6 billion, I'm sorry.
That's right.
18.6 billion.
Exactly. So this is a big extra investment into schools. What it translates to is per student funding growth across every school in your electorate. Mm-hmm. And for those schools of the greatest need, including your government schools in Fisher, you're going to see per student funding growth sitting above 5%. And that's well above any current measure of inflation or wages growth, meaning that those schools are able to plan with certainty to provide extra support to the kids who most need it.
I think over the 10 years, the schools in Fisher are seeing an increase. I'm not sure whether this is just Fisher or nationally, a 75% increase in funding. Is that right?
Yeah, because in that ballpark in terms of the strong growth that nationally goes from about $17 billion of investment in our schools this year, in 2017, growing all the way up to around $30 billion by 2027. So it's steady, consistent growth, meaning schools can engage in long-term planning, all will be locked into law. We're not doing this by special deals with states or anything else. We're changing the Education Act so that people can have the certainty that needs-based funding will be there for them long into the future.
Great. And just in relation to drilling down into some of the specific schools, I'm reading off this sheet, so I don't expect you to know every school in the Commonwealth, but in schools like Glasshouse Christian College, we're seeing a $26 million increase in funding over the 10 years. Chancellor State College, $22 million. Unity College, $27 million. These are all increases over a 10-year period. Merredin State College, $21 million. Siena Catholic College, $17 million. Kawana Waters State College, $13 million. So we're seeing decent increases in funding over the long term. I think it would be pretty hard to argue that these aren't fair.
They're long-term by their nature, so they give long-term certainty, year-on-year increases. They're targeted according to need, so it's important to remember that 5.1% growth per annum in those government schools in Fisher, slightly lower rates of growth in some of the non-government schools. All of that, though, reflecting the need, but for each and every one of them, growth that is real growth, extra money, above wages growth, that means they can back and put more resourcing behind the kids who need extra support in their classrooms.
So there's not one school, as my understanding is, there's not one school in my electorate that's going to see a reduced funding over the short or longer term.
That's right. So this means they can plan with confidence, invest where it's needed most, and we want to back that by having further evidence that David Gonski will undertake in his new review, looking at how it is that funding can best be used in schools to achieve educational excellence, to address some of our declining performances as a nation in literacy and numeracy, to make sure that we get value for money, bang for our buck, out of that record $18.6 billion of extra investment.
Great. One last question. I have a disabled daughter, so it's very important to me that we see adequate resources being provided to disabled kids. We hear stories in the news that disabled kids aren't going to get the same sort of funding that they've had in the past. What do you say to that?
Well, that's not true. And well, it is true, I guess, in a sense, in that they're going to receive additional support in the future. So while overall per student funding grows by around 4.5% under these reforms, support for students with a disability grow by about 6%. So faster growth of those loadings to support students with disability, and a new approach that will see us not pay one flat disability loading for any student with a disability in schools, but instead 3 different levels that allows us to guarantee that the greatest support goes to those who need the greatest adjustment assistance, the greatest help in the classroom to be able to participate and succeed.
So the disabled kids are actually going to get a greater increase than your non-disabled children?
Faster funding growth for students with disability compared with overall growth in school funding, and better targeted so that we can make sure the greatest amount of that disability dollar goes to the people who need the biggest help.
Terrific. Simon, thank you very much for the work that you've done. I know it's probably like trying to like herd cats, I suppose, trying to pull all this together and come up with an equitable system for the whole country, but you've done very well.
Thanks, Andrew. My pleasure.